Hey, happy Tuesday. Happy book review day. Today's book is actually a series, and I've done a couple like this before, but this happens to be Lloyd Alexander, his series of books. They were the Prydain series, Chronicles. I don't know exactly what they're called, but they begin with the Black Cauldron and the Book of the Three, the High King. There's five of them in the series. Then there's a short story collection called I think the Foundling Tales. These were things that I read when I was younger. This was like my middle school, high school fantasy books that I really enjoyed. And it's funny, I don't find very many people who had read these. A lot of people read, Tolkien, and I had read Tolkien as well. And then at the time, I was growing up in Saline, Michigan, and we have a small library, but the librarian was very helpful. And I said, like, I kind of like these books, but I want more. And so she pointed me to these Lloyd Alexander books, and they were very similar to the Tolkien stuff, right? I mean, they're at the basic premise, it is an unexpected hero. In this case, in the Lloyd Alexander books, the main character is Taran or Taran, Taran, and he's an assistant pig keeper. And he essentially gets called the way, that Frodo or Bilbo, depending on which of the Lord of the Rings or Hobbit books you want to look at, get called in a way that's unexpected, right? And this is not the person that you would typically call as a hero. But he gets called, and then they amass a crew of people, a posse, a party, and he goes on adventures, and of course they fight against evil, and it fits that kind of fantasy mold. I read those as a kid. Hadn't thought. I mean, I thought about them periodically, but I hadn't read them again probably since I was maybe 15. And I turned 50 this year, so a lot of time had transpired. And I happened to see that they had a 50th anniversary reissue of them coming out on audiobook. So I listened. The first two books, Black Cauldron and Book of the Three, were bundled together. So I listened to those, and it made me wonder a bit more about the differences between Lord of the Rings, I guess Middle Earth in general, and Lloyd Alexander's books. So I thought I'd look them up a bit, and I would just share some of the stuff that I learned that I thought were kind of interesting. So Tolkien definitely comes first, timeline wise. Like if you look at who was born first, he was born in the 1890s, and Lloyd Alexander doesn't come around. He's not born until 1924. So Tolkien definitely comes first, and his books. Like The Hobbit was published in 37, where Lloyd Alexander's Book of the Three, the first of the Prydain series, doesn't come out until 64. So there's a good 30 years there. So there's no debating that Lloyd Alexander, beat him to the punch or anything like that. They're definitely working kind of from the same, the same set of resources and influences, I think. But Lloyd Alexander has the benefit of knowing that, the Lord of the Rings occurred, and has certainly read them. So Tolkien was British, and Lloyd Alexander was American. It's interesting, though, like when I actually dig into direct influences, it doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that Lloyd Alexander said, I saw what Tolkien did and I wanted to kind of do my own thing. He growing up or being born in the 20s and then growing up in the 30s and 40s and 50s, really had a tradition of fantasy that benefited from Tolkien. And so there are a lot of writers at that time that he kind of drew from, I'm sure, Tolkien being one of them, but not necessarily explicitly so. I found it really interesting just thinking about the very basic differences of the books. The Middle Earth books are fairly long. I think they're all like 350 to 400 pages ish, where the Prydain books are significantly shorter. So I think the audience, the idea that these books were for somebody younger was cooked into those Prydain books. They are all about 190 pages, 212, something right in that range. So they're much more accessible. They're very quick. Surface level. One of the things as a kid that I didn't care at all about the Middle Earth books were all the poetry and like the songs and things like that. And frankly, I skipped that stuff. There's none of that in the Prydain stories. I mean, there are, I guess maybe there are a couple quotes here and there, but not lengthy poems the way they were in the Hobbit books and that kind of thing. I also think from what I can tell that there's a lot less criticism of Lloyd Alexander for any kind of overt depictions of races in the way that Tolkien seemed to have bias kind of cooked into some of his characters. There's definitely diversity of character type and type of people and creatures and things like that in the Lloyd Alexander books, but they are more, I don't know, more fair, kinder. It doesn't feel like they're harsh criticisms of people that perhaps they're based on stereotypes about. I also really found, listening to these again, struck by how much hope there was built into the Lloyd Alexander books, and this real connection to nature that was really, I thought, really interesting. You know, there's lots of looking for signs in nature and paying attention to the trees and your surroundings and the path, and connecting with creatures in a way that there's less in the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books. Now, you could say, okay, well, great. You know, Tolkien was writing during World War II and then, World War I, and then, you know, dealt with like a lot of disturbance and upset. So they're influenced by their times for sure. But thinking about these objectively, I guess, and kind of what you get is you get a very different feel of fantasy. There is the kind of mystical nature of both of them. But, you know, in the Lloyd Alexander ones, I get more of a sense of hope and possibility, and less doom and gloom. You know, I'm trying to think of what else to say here. I don't know. It was fun reading and comparing them and revisiting, you know, and an anniversary is always a great opportunity to kind of go back and reassess something. So if you've never read any of the Lloyd Alexander books, I'd recommend it, especially if you like fantasy. You know, and if you really like Tolkien and you haven't read it in a while, you might want to go back and reassess it and reread it as well. Reading these two kind of side by side, I thought was a really interesting experiment. And I'd be curious to see what you thought. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. Something a little different for Tuesday book review day. But let me know what you're reading.